Welcome to the Co-Creators podcast. I'm Chloe Anderson.
And I'm Lakita Williams, and we help leaders and organizations build the future of work. Welcome to the Co-Creators podcast.
We're back for another week.
Yes, we are. And this week, our question is, what if people see the things I'm not good at?
Yes. And this, Lakita, I feel like this comes up with every single coaching client. Like we are all out here trying to be great at everything all the time. and it's not working, and it's exhausting.
Yes, it's both not working and exhausting. And one of the first pieces of the, conversations we have with folks is let's understand you. Right? Like one of the ways to combat this is to really understand yourself and what are your unique strengths and inputs. And then we can work from there. But often if people feel like they're working from a deficit, I think they tend to double down of like, okay, I'm not good at this particular area of the business. I think we were talking earlier, operations comes up a lot.
Yeah.
I'm not good at this area of the business. And what if people know that, right? Can I lead a team and not be someone who's excellent at executing in operations? And so one of the things that can really affirm us is to understand, what am I really good at? So we have clarity about that. And then I think it gives people sometimes permission to go into the like, oh, I'm just like a zone of competence or zone of even incompetence in this area.
Right. And what's so interesting about these conversations, or what I have found so interesting, and I will say for myself, I had the same experience. Like you asked me not too long ago, okay, what would you say your strengths are? Like as we're going into like our strategy for 2026, right? We were talking, and it like took me a little bit, which is a really interesting thing because I feel like that actually happens with clients often, where you ask the question and they're like, well, I don't know. And it's fascinating when you think about the paradox that happens because I can't name my strengths, but also I don't want anyone to think I have any weaknesses, which is kind of wild, right? Yeah. Like it's just a really interesting experience. And so sometimes the process of identifying strengths becomes like a whole coaching session, right?
Yes.
Like we spend a whole session talking through this and identifying that. Sometimes that is, you talked about like assessing that. Sometimes that's, well, and we generally will do assessments with folks when it comes to like actual, right, personality assessments, work style assessments, different things. So that's one. But then there's also like, I've had clients reach out to past coworkers and
which is great,
past partners to ask the question, like what, and you can frame it in different ways, right? Like, what did you love about working with me? Right. And that can be a great way to identify strengths without necessarily saying, what are my strengths? You can also ask that question, like, what did you see as my strengths? So that's 100% a valid question. But that first piece of identifying, like, what are your strengths is a great practice. And I will say, in my experience as women, those of us who were raised as women, socialized as women, we're taught often, whether it's explicitly or implicitly, to be self-deprecating a lot. And so even that, like it really is a whole practice to start to identify your strengths and lean into them and like state, I am good at this thing. Even that like gives me a little bit of anxiety initially to be like, okay, yes, I can say this. I can say I'm good at this thing. But it is tricky.
Yeah, it is. But the the benefits far outweigh anything else. And so when you go through that process, I love this reach out because I think that it gives us a lot more nuance, specifically, whereas an assessment will give us a word, a definition. It'll often ring true. But when we ask people for their thoughts about what our strengths are, we get a bit more nuance and we get some stories that go along with it, which help us really understand how this shows up for us. So once we can land in that place of here are my strengths, then we can say, okay, what are the gaps here? And one of the things that I'm sure we talked about this many times on the pod, um, is that we share with clients often is the big leap, kind of old school. But my very favorite thing about the book is the 4 zones. So it's a zone of incompetence, zone of competence, zone of excellence, and zone of genius, right? And so when we can understand our zone of genius and even our zone of excellence, that gives us permission to then say, okay, everything else outside of that, where can I identify support where it is someone else's zone of excellence or zone of genius? And I just find that labeling so helpful. Like when I'm struggling to say, oh, I don't know this or I don't understand this, I'm like, oh, I'm just competent in this or incompetent in this. And so who else might be better? Naming is such a powerful tool for that.
And it's been so useful for us, even in our partnership,
Hmm.
having that discussion to have that labeling to be able to
Yeah.
say, oh, this probably isn't my zone of genius, right?
Yeah.
How often do I fall into the trap of like, oh, I can do that. Oh, I can do that, right? Because that's my like, I want to be all things to all people. And you're great at being like, okay, you can do it. Is this your zone of genius? Or would it be better to have someone else do this thing? Right. And that's such a helpful conversation.
Yes.
It also gives us permission to not be great at things. Like sometimes there are things we have to do and
Yeah.
we don't have someone else who can do it. That's just the nature of where we're at in terms of our business or our leadership. And it then gives me permission to be like, okay, this is my zone of competence. So I'm going to feel fine about how
Yes.
I'm doing this thing
Doing the
instead
best
of,
that I can do.
right, beating
Exactly.
myself up, taking
Exactly.
hours and hours to do something that like I probably should only spend 20 minutes on and just being like, no, this is my zone of competence. That's okay.
It's good enough.
Yep.
Yes. And I love this because the best leaders we know, right, are people who are really, really good at this. We will be in the middle of training, we'll be in the middle of conversation, even within the context of someone being with their team, and they'll say, hey, this isn't an area that's great for me, but you know what team member is really good at this is this person. And what we find, back to our question about, what if people see the things I'm not good at, is that the team actually respects that a lot more versus someone pretending that this is a zone of genius for them. And everyone can see that it's not.
Absolutely. And it models for your team that
Yes.
they can also do the same thing. I think, I was thinking about different assessments and I really love 360s.
Hmm.
And when I am debriefing them, I am really careful about the gaps, right? And how we talk about the
Mm,
gaps because it can be so easy to see that feedback and think, oh, I need to be much better at this. What do I do to
yes.
get better at this? Versus going, how do I support myself in this area? And those are two very different things, right?
Totally. Yes. Yes.
And so it's interesting because the other thing I found is often in corporate culture, people have their performance reviews
Yes.
and every you're getting rated on all these things and I think it does a disservice in some ways. Like yes,
Hmm.
we need a way to evaluate performance and accountability is important, ownership, all those things. And it drives this wheel of I've got to be good at everything. I've got to keep being great at everything versus what are the things I'm great at and then how am I getting support or collaborating,
Partnership.
partnerships,
Yes.
all those pieces to accomplish these other things that I'm not good at, right? That
Yeah.
are in my zone of competence or my zone of incompetence, right? Like how I do that. So that would be like if you're listening to this and you have your own business and do performance evaluations of your folks, this is something to think about. Like how do we drive different behaviors around this so that rather than people feeling like they have to be good at everything, we build genius teams, right?
Yes. Genius teams, TM. Look, I love that. Uh, I love that. And I think that's what co-creation is all about. And if you're listening to this, as Chloe said, like challenge ourselves, because one of the narratives that I see online a lot or in conversations with business leaders is that I only want quote unquote A players on my team, right? And so when we think through that lens, often is thinking someone needs to meet perfection, and that's just not possible. That we each have strengths, growth opportunities, and weaknesses. So I separate those two, because if something is a weakness, you might not ever get to a place where it is a good area for you, right? Or that it's something that you can do even decently. And so we genius teams allow us to bring in a myriad of strengths, and then as a result have the absolute best outcomes from the differences across. So we tell leaders, right, be realistic in what you're asking people to do. Let's get the right people in the right roles. There are some things we have to agree upon, from a working agreements perspective. There are certain skills and ways of working that are important for the team, but we also have to understand what are some things that are negotiable and what are non-negotiables, right? Ownership is one that we say, if that's a gap for you, you'll have a hard time in many, many organizations, right? But
Yeah.
not everybody is going to be excellent at copywriting. Not everyone is going to be excellent at managing other people, right? So really getting clear on what are the things we're prioritizing versus not, and doing that for yourself, but also recognizing how to think about that as the leader of a team.
And I think this is actually a pretty big shift for a
Yeah.
lot of people because there's so much when it comes to business culture, like up or out, right? We need people up or
Mm-hmm.
out. And no, we need people in their zones of genius.
Mm-hmm.
And some people's zones of genius is going to be, I am such a great operator and executor,
Yes.
and I do this so well. And do you know what? I'm not going to ever become the director of operations because that's not actually my area of genius in terms of the strategy, right? I'm a
Mm-hmm.
great whatever that looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be tricky, and it also requires us really thinking about like how do we motivate ourselves, how do we motivate our teams, how do we reward the behaviors that we want to see in folks. um Talking about like in a team meeting, is there an opportunity to say to your team, hey, I'd love to hear from everyone one thing that you asked for help with this week, one
Yeah.
way you collaborated with someone this week to get us to genius team level, right? Like
Yeah.
there's some really great things we can do. And it starts with us, right? It
It
has to
does.
start with us.
Mm-hmm.
And that
Yeah.
understanding of like, what are our gaps, modeling what those gaps are.
And being transparent,
Yeah,
right? I
yeah.
think that's the theme, right? Is that there are things you aren't good at, don't hide them, right? Be clear about it. If you need support in either like it's just a growth opportunity and you want to grow in that area, or it's something that you just need to fill the gap because it's a gap that is insurmountable or
Right.
uninteresting even for you to develop in, let's take that step. And so transparency, I think, is key. And when you do that, hold yourself accountable to being transparent, and also not well, what's the better way to say this? Also don't put unrealistic expectations on the team.
Absolutely. And that I think is such an important expectation like for
Yeah.
yourself, right? To think
Yeah.
through that. Um as we talk about these things, right? We're always like practical steps. How do we implement this? We talked about initially, first you have to understand what
Mm-hmm.
your strengths are. And if you're listening to this and you're like, I don't know, right? We've given you some ideas around like how you can identify those assessments, conversations with people you've worked with, and like really getting comfortable with owning those strengths and
Yes.
like shining in those
Yes.
areas. And I think that's a mindset shift for some of us, right? As far as like, nope, I'm going to talk about this and people are going to know this is one of my strengths. Then figuring out for those areas that aren't your strengths, right? How do you get support in that area and being transparent with the team, right?
Mm-hmm.
Being transparent with the people you work with, whatever that looks like. I actually think we do a pretty good job at this within our team internally. And part of it is the language, right? Like we have adopted that zone of excellence, zone of the that language, which I
Yeah.
think makes a huge difference. So, what's the language that you might want to use around this? The language also makes it a lot less scary. I think, at least for
Yeah.
me, in
Yeah.
terms of owning like things I'm not good at, right? And being okay with people seeing that because we've created this
This
infrastructure
absolutely.
and language.
And the shared words
Yeah,
and understanding of what it means. And then what we'll say is that transparency piece, which we talked about. So being transparent with yourself, being transparent with others. And in that, after you take that step, we do have to address the gap, right? And so,
absolutely. Yeah.
what is the gap now that we have moved from a space of acknowledging to transparency? We have some shared language around we don't all need to be the perfect. What do we do to solve what the gap is? Because we also can't just let the gap go on, so we need to address it, and we're able to do that internally in the team. Maybe you have to do it externally, but it all starts from acknowledging strengths. And I think people would be surprised that we're saying, hey, start there instead of like naming out your weaknesses. But again, the goal here is to really not fight against yourself, right? And so
Yeah.
when we
Yeah.
can acknowledge our strengths, it opens us up to, oh, this is actually not an area that I am strong in, and so what can we do to address it?
I, and this just something that just came up for
Mm,
me thinking about like you start with owning your strengths also
yeah.
because it makes it so that you have something in your bank so that when you're
Mm,
owning those gaps, weaknesses, whatever you want to, whatever they are, you know that you've got things in the bank, right? Like
yeah.
you know that you've got that there and it makes it a lot easier. And then for me, one of the ways that I've really started to identify and notice, right, when I'm trying to move something that's real competence all the way to genius, even though it's
Mm,
not accurate. It's when I go, for me, it's when I say, oh, I can do that too, right? If I find myself, and that it's my own internal, right? I know what it feels like when that happens in my body. Like, oh, but I can do that. And then being able to take a step back and being like, and I cannot do that better than these folks, and I'm not the best person to do this.
yeah.
So, like, yes, that is probably true. I probably can do this thing. And am I the best person to do it? And am I going to do it, and well, is there right, all those pieces come into play. But I think we often talk with clients. In fact, I feel like every session with a client there's something I want them to be noticing, and that this is a
Yes.
great thing to do, is just start to
Yes.
notice when you have those feelings of insecurity, whatever that sounds like for you. For me, it's like, oh, I can do it. For you, it's going to be
Yeah.
different, but figuring
Yeah.
out what that looks like,
I
right?
think that's so true. I think I love the piece around perfectionism because I think that is actually how it shows up a lot for me is I am trying to reach some perfect, but the gap there is way too big, right? And so that is a signal that okay, yeah, this is not an area where I can get to perfect. Perfect doesn't exist, but really, really close. And perfect is, close to perfect. Zone of genius is what we're looking for here. So let's tap someone else in, and that's a great opportunity for us to bring together that genius team that can then make this a reality. I love it.
The last thing I will say is, I will be training people on delegation. And this is
Hmm.
something that we
Hmm.
dive into really deeply, is who's the right person for this? Do you need to be the person doing this? And also, what's the level that we need to do this thing at,
Hmm.
right? Because that's the other thing, is we sometimes create some arbitrary goal of like, this has to be this level of perfect.
Yeah.
Well, what's your actual business strategy? What are you trying to accomplish? Does that thing actually need to be perfect?
Hmm.
Or is 80% good enough, right, for
Hmm.
what you're trying to do? So there's also some play there that it's really important to understand what your goals are, what your strategy are, is as you're thinking about who's the right person, what level do we need to do this at, what does perfect look like.
I agree. Yeah.
Right. Perfect doesn't exist,
It
but
doesn't, yeah. But
yeah,
close. Damn
yeah.
good. I think, and the last note that I'll add here is that all of this is also burnout prevention, right? We burn out not from hours we work and days we work. Sure, that can happen, but oftentimes it's when we're reaching for something that's not possible, when we are spending our energy in the ways that aren't effective and aren't the best use of time, and frustration creeps in, right? In the elements of like, I'm never going to do this. That's a recipe for burnout. So, in leaning into your strengths, acknowledging the strengths of others, and letting that genius team come together, then we're talking about a lot more long term sustainability for us as a group.
Yes, and it helps to get out of that compare and compete mindset
Mm-hmm.
of like, well, I'm not as good as this person. I'm not like I should be
Yes.
this, I should be that. In fact, I just saw someone talking the other day to like a team of younger soccer players and
Mm-hmm.
talking about like Messi and Ronaldo and going through all the things that they've missed in their careers, like penalty kicks they've missed, World Cup championships they lost, and basically saying, even right, and we would argue these are genius soccer
Mm-hmm.
players.
Players. Mm-hmm.
They're still not perfect. They still miss things, but they know their strengths. They lean into them. They're resilient, right? They build up that resilience, which is what you were just talking about: burnout prevention,
Mm-hmm.
sustainability, making sure that you've got support, making sure you're in your area of genius and that you're really connected to that. And understanding like zone of genius is not perfect all the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. And your zone of genius is yours. So stay there.
Yeah.
So to answer what if people see the things I'm not good at, I think we gave you plenty to work with here. If this is coming up as a challenge, as Chloe mentioned, not only do we want you to start with understanding your strengths, but we would also love to hear from you. And if this is helpful, if it's not, where do the gaps still exist? And we'll talk about this further on another episode of the podcast. As always, thank you for your leadership. Thanks for listening.
We hope today's conversation gave you something to think about and, more importantly, something you can use. If this episode resonated with you, we'd love for you to share it with another leader, entrepreneur, or friend who might benefit from hearing it. And for additional resources, frameworks, and tools related to our topic, please be sure to subscribe to our newsletter at CoCreateWork.com. And of course, if you have any question you'd like us to explore in a future episode, we would love to do that. So please send it to podcast@CoCreateWork.com. As always, thank you for being here and thank you for your leadership.